Hello, everyone, and welcome to PressThis, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here every week on PressThis. As a reminder, you can follow me on Twitter at WPDavidV. You can subscribe to PressThis on Red Circle, iTunes, or Spotify. And of course, you can download the latest episodes at WMR.fm. In this episode, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is avoiding time-killing tech debt on WordPress builds. And joining us for this conversation from Hallam, I'd like to welcome Jon Martin. Jon, welcome to PressThis.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
I practiced pronouncing Hallam before the show, but of course I messed it up right in the beginning, Jon. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Awesome. So for those listening, what Jon's going to share is his thoughts on the impact of tech debt to WordPress development teams. Like, what does it mean to have tech debt and how does it affect you? How you can think about reducing your tech debt on every project, and then why you have a responsibility to share tech debt considerations with your clients if you're working in a freelance or agency capacity. So I love killing tech debt. I love eliminating it. It's one of my favorite topics. But we're going to get down to Jon's thoughts on the topic. But before we kick that off, Jon, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask every guest. Briefly tell me about your WordPress origin story. When was the first time you used WordPress?
So that would have been in the early 2010s. I'm not really sure of the correct expression for that time period. So I actually started myself and the CEO of Hallam started an agency in 2008. And at the time, WordPress was still very much a blogging platform. We were building websites that had lots of rich content on it. So it's a bit of a dirty word, but we did use Joomla at the time. But then
I don't think Joomla is a dirty word. I like all open source CMS personally.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, it's a great project. I think the key thing for us is that over time, where Joomla was really, really strong, when WordPress put out custom post type support, that was when things really, really changed for WordPress for me, and it elevated it from as it was known as a blogging platform to being a proper, fully fledged CMS that you could do all kinds of sites on, whether it was for a really small one person business or a freelancer or whatever, all the way up to massive enterprise grade complex websites. And I think really for me that was a killer decision on their part, because it's part of the reason why WordPress is so popular now. So that was where when I actually started using it. Actually the story before that really is myself and the now CEO of Hallam. We were in a band together, and we had this bright idea of thinking, well, you know what, we want to tour some more and spend a bit more time on the road, and it was really hard to get time off from our current jobs. So we thought, you know what, let's start an agency and become web developers, because that will really help getting all that time back. That was a great decision. I'm really, really pleased we did that, but it was also certainly a naive decision, because thinking that working for yourself gives you more time was definitely a mistake that I think we recognized a little bit later on. And before that point, I knew a bit about SQL, and I've been building computers since, since graphics card only supported 4 colors. So for anybody else who knows what CGA is, that'll help give you an idea how old I am. But yeah, so really it was when CPTs came out that changed everything for us. We started to use WordPress pretty much overnight. Actually, that became our chosen CMS, and we haven't looked back. We've used it since, and
it's really funny. Out of all the people I've asked this question to, very few have actually clued in on how material custom post types were relative to their WordPress origin story. And it's funny, I have a similar story. I founded an agency in 2010, so a little bit after y'all, but when custom post types had kind of already gone in. And we started building with Joomla and switched to WordPress for similar reasons, but it was those custom post types and custom meta fields that I agree, and I actually present it this way in various formats, is that it was this kind of moment when WordPress really became a true CMS. A year after that, WooCommerce came into existence, WP Engine came into existence, a lot of other brands in the WordPress space. It was such a transformative time. It's interesting to hear you kind of reference that as the root of your origin story. Now, you were telling me though about Hallam and yeah, the founding moment there, if you will. But could you briefly tell me a little bit about Hallam and what you do at Hallam?
Yeah, sure. So actually, that agency we founded wasn't Hallam at the time. We later merged with Hallam.
Okay, thank
And
you.
the main reason for that actually is because back in those older days there was a very quite discrete difference between we build websites versus we do SEO and all those kind of things, and there wasn't really that many around that were integrating the approach and actually thinking about things like user experience and how does that work with SEO and development and all that kind of stuff. So that was actually why we ended up later merging with Hallam. Hallam had been around for about 20 years, and our founder set up pretty much right back at the beginning of when SEO started to become a thing. So we merged the two agencies 6-7 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. My memory for dates is not great, I must admit. And then really, yeah, that's become our approach, is this full integrated approach about mixing all these different disciplines all together to help people succeed online. So we do PPC, SEO, digital PR, obviously web design and dev, brands, digital strategy, all this kind of stuff, all of these good disciplines that you really need to have a good, strong digital presence these days.
What's your role there at the company?
So my job title is technical director. So I'll be honest, doesn't really quite cover everything that I do. I ran the development team for a long period of time. So all the WordPress work we did was under my directorship. I'm pleased to say we have far better developers in the team than Julio and I ever were when we first started out, which is part of the reason why we're doing much better these days, and we understand things a bit more. So I ran the development team for a long period of time. More recently, I look after the data team as well. So that means I get to play with machine learning and Python and Martech. And
so all this playing, though, I got to imagine all this playing and doing cool stuff for clients has got to result in some tech debt along the way. And so I'm curious, like, how you think about, like, what are the common types of tech debt? And maybe specific to WordPress builds for a minute, but like, how do you think about that as you think about, Hallam and how y'all manage your tech debt? Like, do you bucket it into types with WordPress builds?
Yeah, we do. I mean, not necessarily. We do in kind of language. We don't necessarily categorize things or go through a strict process for categorizing it, but really they do fall into 3 different buckets. One of them is when you build bad code on top of existing bad code, and that might be because maybe you made some mistakes in the past. That might be because you've inherited a website from somebody else. Whatever the reason is. So that's the sort of first bucket. The second one is building code that isn't necessary, and maybe just isn't necessary right now. I'm sure we've all been on the end of feature requests from clients and brands that we work with where they're really keen for a particular thing, but actually it might not be the right thing in terms of getting actual value for the customers. And then the third one, which is the biggest one I see actually, is building features that should actually really be on a different platform. So understanding that kind of architectural piece about, okay, what are the different bits that we're plugging in here? Here's a CRM. Here is the website, which fundamentally really is about marketing the business. Here's your order fulfillment platform. All those sort of different.
So let me ask you a fundamental question here. Like you've kind of listed the 3 types, but it sounds like these are the 3 types of tech debt you want to get rid of, right? Bad code on bad code, code that's not necessary, features that could be done on another platform. Like, isn't there a 4th bucket, like features you want that are valuable and therefore the tech debt is maybe good in that case? Is that fair to say that's a 4th bucket?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, not all technical debt is bad. There are, you have to accept that pretty much any feature that you're going to build will accrue some type of technical debt, and you've got to make a call about whether that technical debt is good or not. Some is good, some is bad, and really it depends on, it's that keyword I said before, it's about value. Are you going to get the value that you need for that thing? Well, more importantly, is the customer, the ultimate customer, not your client, but their customers, are they going to get the value for it? And that's usually a pretty good guiding light as to whether to accept that technical debt or not.
Yeah, I want to kind of deep dive into, how you think about that quote worth it formula for when it's okay to accept or not. But it's good to think about, get a good understanding of how you think of the different buckets of types of tech debt, and particularly those you might want to optimize to remove. What I'd like to do next, though, is get an understanding of, like, Was there a thing that kind of drove you over the edge to focus in this area? But we're going to take our first break, and we'll be right back.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Press This, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I'm interviewing Jon Martin about avoiding time-killing tech debt. Jon, right before the break, you were explaining that the way you think of the three types of tech debt that you might want to eliminate is building bad code on bad code, creating code that's not necessary for the success of the site you're working on, and then maybe building out code for features that could be better served on another platform. Before we kind of get into like the quote worth it formula, though, I was wondering, was there like a particular, I don't know, time in your journey or a particular instance of tech debt that kind of surfaced this for you as a primary focus area for Hallam?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's one real landmark project that started to get me thinking about this about 4 or 5 years back now. I mean, I've seen plenty of other cases too, because businesses accrue technical debt all the time, not just through WordPress, through all kinds of things. Actually, businesses accrue it through their operational processes as well. It doesn't even have to be a technical thing where you accrue that debt. But the one story that really stands out in my mind more than any is a client that we work with, a relatively small company. We did a lot of paid media work for them. Essentially selling stuff online. It was an e-commerce business, and they had traditional kind of mail order, but a lot of their work, and they were trying to drive more of the traffic online, so they didn't have to go through mail order. It could all be managed through their website. And they came to us because they'd had a site built for them. It's completely bespoke, and they'd been around for about 10 years at that point. So it was getting pretty old, starting to creak a little bit. Standards have moved on, technology's moved on. It's time to have a bit of a rethink. So the client sat down with us. They started to brief in all the different things they did on their website, and it became really clear very quickly to me that there was all kinds of business logic and business operational stuff that had been built into the website. And that was logic that they used for fulfilling orders, and it was quite specific to the way that they work with suppliers. So I won't go into the detail, but they had quite a complex arrangement between the suppliers and how they fulfilled orders and whether it got shipped into their shop before it got sent out, all this kind of stuff. So it was all quite complicated. Now, the business owner and the previous developer they worked with had eventually built this system that pretty much managed that entire thing for them. It was a really, really good system at the time, and genuinely helped that business grow massively. Now, what they hadn't really thought about is that all websites eventually have a shelf life. They will become end of life at some point, just like any software. And in the marketing world, that shelf life is usually relatively short compared to, for example, if you invest in a CRM as a business, you'll normally have that kicking around for quite some time, up to about 10 years, if not more. Websites, generally speaking, between sort of 2 to 5 years. We find most, at least big brands, tend to rebuild every 3 years or so. So the problem then was that they built all of this complicated logic into the existing website, and they had to rebuild the entire website. And all of a sudden, you have to rebuild all this business logic as well. Now, we costed the project up, and it basically ended up being about half of the annual turnover of the business just to rebuild what they already had. And that really started to get me to think about this thing, is that, well, okay, if they approached the problem in a different way originally, for example, let's think about the different things that we're trying to achieve at the website. This bit is for marketing, this bit is for selling products, this bit is for order fulfillment, this is bits for managing my business process with suppliers, all those kind of things. And thought in a bit more of a modular way about that, then it would have been a much different situation for this client. And actually, it was a real problem for them, because they had a website that was essentially where they made all the money from. It was creaking quite a lot because it's quite old, but at the same time, it was going to cost so much to rebuild that entire website. It made the project very, very complicated. We managed to find some pretty clever, but also not nice workarounds in the end to try and use what they already had and integrate it with a WooCommerce site. But ultimately it ended up being a much more painful, much slower, and much more expensive than it needed to be if that architecture had been thought about originally.
Oh, I have so many projects I want to forget about that were just like that, Jon. I can picture it now. I'm going, like, taking me back in time on this. So, like, to me, that sounds like a pretty it's a very I think salient lesson to think about the kind of cost to the business relative to the refactor that you were planning. And to me, it sounded like the clear answer was you needed to architect it differently. And that's kind of maybe a clear path, if you will, to like what you should do. But I think like a lot of teams, when they think about tech debt, it's like they think like, okay, well, it'd be cool to do this thing, but is it worth it? Is it worth me maintaining this thing over time? So I'm just curious, like how you think about that formula yourself or with your clients, and like when is it okay to introduce tech debt, and how much, and just how do you think about that formula as a whole?
Yeah, you touched on a really important point there, is that, you think about the nature of developers. Developers get into this because they love doing cool stuff. And that's, it's a big part of our motivation, is to learn how to do new things, new technology, new JavaScript frameworks, whatever the thing is. And that naturally gives us the motivation then becomes to build cool stuff. But we don't necessarily think long term about that. We've still got to maintain it. My wife would love to get a hot tub at our house, but I know that somebody's got to clean that. And I'll be honest, I don't want to be the one that cleans it. It's that type of thinking in your mind. So it's a really, really, really good question to think about. Is it actually worth it in the first place? And if we break that down a little bit, there's a few different things you could be thinking about. First of all, think long term. What is the total cost of ownership of building that thing, of testing it and maintaining it, and then weigh that up against the value that we get from it. So, for example, there may be a really simple way that you could solve that problem using spreadsheets, or using a slightly different architecture of things, where maybe somebody internally at the company manages that for a short period of time, and it would be cheaper to do that and more effective to do that than it would be to build this really complicated feature that, when you actually look at the total cost of ownership, it's going to cost more than it would do for somebody to spend a couple of hours a week to do a particular thing. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big believer in automation. Technology should be automating as much as possible to avoid that kind of admin. But
do you, sorry to interrupt, but do you use like those manual approaches to like try something out before you code it to make sure that value is going to be there? I mean, I get the idea of like simplifying the specs, or like, oh, can we do this manually instead? I'm just curious if you've ever approached it from like a testing perspective to like see if the ultimate return is worth it.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm a big believer in agile methodology, and fundamentally, one of the big key tenets of agile is that you build the right thing at the right time, and you focus on getting value as quickly as possible. So you want to be building the minimum viable product. Now, that means that you don't necessarily have something that's fully feature rich at that point, but it gives you a platform where you can then start to test it. Are you actually getting the thing that you want from that? Are your users responding to it in the way that you expected them to? Anybody who's worked within UX or and web dev will know that quite often we'll get requests from customers because they think that their customers will want that, but actually, do they really want it? So that's another really good question to ask, is, once you've kind of thought about that long-term view, do the people going to use the website, do we know that they want to use it, or do we need to test to see if they want to use it? And then once we've done that test, we can work out whether we should invest more in it, or whether we should back off and actually put our investment elsewhere.
So it sounds like, to kind of recap those thoughts, and I liked your idea of looking at the total cost of ownership long term. I think a lot of times teams think, even the people, quote, ordering services from the teams think, how many hours or weeks or sprints or points or whatever is this thing going to cost to build? But then, you need to take into account that, how many hours or weeks or sprints or points is it going to take to maintain, and then to use that to balance against the value you're getting out of maintaining that activity. I think obviously that's a sound piece of advice. But then you're also thinking like, well, is there something I can do to test this to see if my assumptions are correct? Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And the only bit that we didn't touch on is the bit that we spoke about a little bit earlier, which is about architecture. Is there a better way that we can structure this to make it better? And that'll tie into object-oriented programming and stuff that I'll probably touch on a little bit later.
Yeah, the architectural considerations. I kind of wrote down how you were like, is there a way we can change the specs? As in my stakeholder training or talks, I often say, spec to launch, right? Ask for what you really need to launch. And so asking those, well, why? And do you really need it? And what about this? questions have been, I found, to be very critical. So it sounds like that's a key part of how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, because every minute that site is in development is a minute that it's not getting value in front of customers. And that's the easy way of thinking about it. You want to get launched as fast as you possibly can, and then test, monitor, iterate, learn, see where you go from there. But only because you're doing that based on actual data rather than what you think is right, because quite often they're not the same.
Yeah, I love that point. Every minute it's in dev is a minute you're not using it to grow. It also ties back to, it kind of ties back to another mantra I have in project management and stakeholder management, which is the two best words in getting a project done are phase two, right? What can we do next? How can we iterate on it?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that when I'm dealing with stakeholders, or when I am a stakeholder, is a powerful part. Okay, cool. Let's talk next about how what teams can do to reduce tech debt. But before we do that, we'll take our last break.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Press This, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I'm in the middle of talking about avoiding time-killing tech debt with Jon Martin of Hallam. Jon, right before the break, we talked a little bit around your worth it formula. I really liked your notions around reducing specs and thinking about TCO and kind of taking an iterative testing approach. But let's dig into now what teams can actually do to reduce their tech debt in WordPress builds. What are some of your favorite techniques for reducing tech debt?
So there's all kinds of technical techniques you can use, and some of them you'll be familiar with, some of you won't. But actually, the starting point for me is a much more kind of soft approach towards it. Talk to your clients about it. You've got to remember that ultimately your clients and these brands come to us because we're the experts. They need our advice. And it's quite easy to fall into the trap that we're there to just do what they want. We're there to do what they want us to do, when actually we're there to challenge what they want to do and to try and improve it. So the first thing you can do is talk to them about it and explain, okay, if we do that, this is going to be the long-term effect of it. It's going to take us an extra day worth of testing every time we do a release. It's going to add a couple of hours onto every time we need to maintain the website and update all the plugins or whatever it is. But by raising that awareness and having those conversations with them, you can get the client to be part of that discussion. And then eventually they become part of the problem solving with it as well. We have to educate our clients all the time, simply because they don't understand the things that we do. If they did, they wouldn't be coming to us in the first place. So that's your starting point. Or key things to remember with that as well is simplify things. Again, people aren't necessarily as technical as we are, so use analogies to talk about it. I always find that houses are a great analogy. Everybody lives in a house. Most people have got some experience of doing some kind of house improvement, so it's quite easy to use that as an analogy to explain it. So that's the kind of the first point, really, is to get the client on side with those conversations. The next thing we already touched on before, which was to have that long-term view. What's the total cost of ownership? And asking yourself those questions and questioning every feature request. But being a little bit more sort of technical and how you would do this on the job. Simple things you can do. Use WordPress standards. There are standards that are there. They do exist for a reason. Now, they will help you as a developer, and maybe you work on a project, then you put it down for a year or two, and then you come back to it. You've got to refresh your memory with that and trying to get your head back into where you were when you first built it. Using standards will help that. It'll also help other people. So if you work within the team, it means you've got this common language that everybody can operate from, which is really, really useful in terms of efficiency and helping with documentation, all these types of things. So that's kind of a softer way of reducing your technical debt by having standards that anybody can work on. It also helps, the time may come where some other WordPress developers are working on that project, and it helps them too. Just think of it as a way of paying back to the community and making it easier for your fellow developers. So that's a good point around kind of standards and making it easy for yourself and others. The next one is more about there's a great coder within the industry, affectionately known as Uncle Bob, who wrote a wonderful book called The Clean Coder many years ago. I would highly recommend that any developer reads that book if they haven't read it. In fact, I made it mandatory reading for our development team for anybody who joined the team, mostly because he's got such a good approach towards he talks about unit testing, all this kind of stuff, but fundamentally, a lot of it is around how do you write code in a way that makes it flexible, that you can very quickly iterate and change and add extra bits into it. And one of the big points that he talks about is about refactoring often. And this is the main thing to take from it, is that you write a piece of code, that doesn't necessarily mean that piece of code is finished. There are things that you can do to optimize it, to make it more portable, to make it more modular, or make it test better, whatever that particular thing is that you need to do. So spend time refactoring code. It can be really, really hard to do when you're up against it on a maybe a tight time frame for a budget. But ultimately, that's the type of thing that will stop you accruing technical debt. And actually, usually that's the way that I see it gets forced in, where there's a project deadline in place. You've got to hit that deadline. Absolutely, you've got to hit it. But it's better to flex the scope than to write bad code that you're then going to
yeah, and I guess educate those clients about that too, because I've never met a developer that didn't want to refactor the code. But it's always the timeline that hits against it. Okay, so here in our last little bit, I'm just curious if if you think of things like offloading and using off-the-shelf plugins as another way to help avoid tech, or another ways to avoid tech debt. Is that on your list as well?
Yeah, 100%. So that's a good way. It's a good way of doing both. Actually, you can avoid technical debt by
get into
plugins, but you can also, and this is, WordPress is a wonderful community. It's so active. Equally, that can also be its worst enemy. There is a plugin that does everything, and there are also lots of plugins that have been built for a very specific purpose, but they don't necessarily match your own purpose. So, I've seen this particularly with some of the developers that like building sites using plugins and kind of the more point and click approach towards things rather than coding it from scratch point of view. People tend to throw a plugin at things. We've worked with websites that have had over 100 plugins on them. A bunch of them aren't maintained anymore. There are security issues all over it. You try and do a new release for it. You spend literally 4 days testing it when you could have done that in a couple of hours. So plugins can be good and can be bad. The right plugin at the right time is a wonderful, wonderful thing, and it's one of the greatest strengths of WordPress. But the wrong plugin at the wrong time can also be severely damaging, and actually can be one of those biggest sources of technical debt.
Oh, I've had a project like that for sure. Well, Jon, this has been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Awesome. If you'd like to learn more about what Jon is up to, you can visit hallam.co.uk. That's hallam.co.uk. Thanks everyone for listening to PressThis, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. Again, this has been your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the WordPress community as part of my role at WP Engine, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here every week on PressThis.
The opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of WebmasterRadio.fm's management or sponsors. Any rebroadcast or redistribution without authorized consent of WebmasterRadio.fm is prohibited.